At 1 p.m. on January 6, 2021, the first line of barricades fell at the Peace Circle, just outside the United States Capitol. The advance on the Capitol perimeter coincided precisely with the start of the joint session, targeting the specific window of time reserved for the constitutional transfer of power. To understand how this coordination functioned, we must examine the legal proceedings against John Eastman, the lawyer at the center of the formal inquiry into the day's events. The physical breach and the legal memos drafted in the weeks prior were the two primary components of a singular effort to subvert the election. Analyzing January 6th requires looking past the imagery of a protest and seeing an attempt to exploit procedural gaps in a 19th century law. The Capitol building functions as more than a symbol. It is the physical site of a rigid statutory mechanism. That mechanism is the Electoral Compact of 1887. This strategy attacked the law on two fronts. Track A fabricated a legal pretext to ignore votes, while Track B mobilized a kinetic assault to halt proceedings by force. These two tracks intersected at the exact moment Congress convened to certify the results. The legal track provided a veneer of ambiguity to create an opening, while physical force served as the violent fallback if the vice president and the courts refused to cooperate. Understanding how this strategy attempted to break the system requires looking at how the Electoral Compact is supposed to operate. Under the 1887 law, state governors sign and submit certificates of ascertainment, which are then routed to the U.S. Capitol for the final count. Those certificates are delivered to the vice president, acting as the president of the Senate, during the joint session. The law is explicit about the vice president's limits. Their role is strictly administrative, limited to opening the certificates so the count can proceed. The statute intentionally prevents the vice president from resolving disputes, leaving the power to reject votes solely to the two houses of Congress. John Eastman was the primary architect of the strategy to bypass these statutory limits. His goal was to produce dual slates of electors in contested states to give the appearance of a legitimate dispute over which votes to count. To justify these alternate slates, the Trump legal team relied on lawsuits like Texas v. Pennsylvania, which presented arguments the courts found to be mathematically and legally baseless. They claimed that an independent victory for Joe Biden in key states was a 1 in a quadrillion statistical improbability. Every institution of the law rejected these claims. The Supreme Court declined the Texas case, and Attorney General Bill Barr informed the president that the allegations of widespread fraud were nonsense. Because the courts neutralized the legal pretext, Track A lacked any institutional standing by the time the sun rose on January 6th. With the judiciary exhausted, the entire legal strategy focused on the final point of failure, Vice President Mike Pence. Eastman argued that the vice president could unilaterally reject certified slates or declare a recess to prevent the count from being completed. This theory stood in direct opposition to Section 16 of the Electoral Compact, which mandates that the joint meeting shall not be dissolved until the result is declared. Pence's legal counsel identified these statutory restrictions, and the vice president ultimately refused to violate the law. The courts, the Department of Justice, and the vice president had held. The legal track had collapsed against the government's institutional firewalls. As the legal options reached a dead end, the physical mobilization in Washington, D.C. began to move. Track B took effect, a kinetic strategy that utilized physical presence to achieve the delay that the vice president legally could not grant. Groups like the Proud Boys bypassed the Ellipse rally and marched directly to the Capitol before the president had even finished speaking. They focused on the Peace Circle, the first line of defense protecting the Capitol complex. The testimonies of filmmaker Nick Quested and Officer Carolyn Edwards describe the physical breach of these barricades just before 1 p.m. The breach occurred just as the joint session began. By 2:13 p.m., the violence forced the chambers to evacuate, accomplishing the very suspension of the count that the legal strategy had failed to secure through memos alone. Inside the Capitol building, the physical breach immediately disrupted the legislative process. The infiltration of tactical groups halted the joint session, temporarily securing the exact recess that Eastman's legal theory had sought. Congressional hearings later investigated the connection between these legal maneuvers and the physical assault on the building. The Select Committee established the coordination behind the dual-track strategy, tracing the path from the Eastman memos to the breach at the peace circle. The violence on January 6th functioned as the physical fallback for a failed legal argument. When the law did not bend, force was applied to break the process. The constitutional process continued only because the structural requirements of the law held, and because specific individuals refused to violate them. The peaceful transfer of power survived, but the events exposed significant vulnerabilities in how the government handles electoral disputes. The assault revealed specific procedural gaps in the 1887 statute, showing how a lack of clarity in the vice president's role could be leveraged to challenge the legitimacy of the transition. In the aftermath, Congress passed the 2022 revision of the Electoral Count Act, which explicitly clarifies the vice president's role and raises the bar for challenging electoral votes. Preserving democratic institutions requires constant maintenance of the underlying laws that protect them against both legal subversion and physical threats.